brand new graphics card has landed, and this time it's the RTX 4080. But should anybody actually buy this GPU? Does it provide that true next-gen performance we've been waiting for? Or actually, is it not particularly worth it? Well, in this video, I'm going to be building an awesome PC to test this GPU out, running those all-important gaming benchmarks, testing Call of Duty Warzone, COD Modern Warfare 2, Apex, and many more, and looking at all the parts that make this system possible. Let's do this! The Corsair HQ5000T provides the ultimate in airflow, RGB lighting and mounting compatibility for PC builds in 2022. With 3 alloy fans included, 160 addressable RGB lights in the front, roof and floor panels, Corsair have really taken things up a notch. Learn more about the awesome 5000T in our build videos over on the channel or at the where to buy links in the description below. Let's start off with a bit of background, shall we, as to the brand new RTX 4080. It's the reason a lot of you are probably here, and I hope I can convince you to stay. This GPU is a pretty interesting proposition to me for a number of reasons. The first is obviously that this is an iterative sort of upgrade to the last gen 3080, but at a more expensive price tag, and considering they're not discontinuing the 3080, it's kind of another option entirely. With 16GB of GDDR6X video memory, some very high clock speeds, and support for Nvidia's new DLSS 3 tech, basically it's an upgrade to DLSS 2 that adds in frame generation and increases frame rates by around about double in our testing. It's actually very impressive, more on that later. This looks to build on all of the success that Nvidia saw with their Ampere architecture, and hopefully usher in a new generation of graphics cards that this time around you can actually buy. And it's for those reasons that this is arguably a more important release than the 1490, a card that was very good but so powerful I'm not really sure anybody actually needs to buy it. This is a card positioned solely for 4K gaming at those high frame rates and high visual fidelity settings, and as you can see from some of our results, it does a very good job of beating out pretty much every other GPU on the market, apart from its bigger brother, the more expensive 4090. Straight rasterization performance is very solid, and the performance gains are exactly what Nvidia advertised when you take into account the last generation. It holds up well against even AMD's top-end 6950 XT, though of course that is set to change in a few weeks with their 7900 XT and XTX models. Not to be confused with a 7900 XT model. In front of me, I've got the GeekaWhat AORUS Master Model, a card that's set to cost even more than the already eye-watering $1,199 of the reference MSRP board, which itself is $500 more than the 3080 launched for just a shade over 2 years ago. If one thing's for certain, this is an expensive GPU. Is it more than twice as good as, you know, the last gen 3080? Yes, but it costs basically double. So as far as I'm concerned, the price to performance metrics for you guys, if anything, probably a bit worse. I don't want to obsess in this video about the price. I just think it's worth keeping in mind before making a purchase decision of these next-gen GPUs. And in a market where all components are getting more expensive, look at how expensive Ryzen 7000 motherboards are, you've got to be careful because the bill on these new parts can rack up very, very quickly. It sits in a 3-slot form factor despite only having 2 PCIe lanes. I think GeekaWhat could have added a third there for sort of structural rigidity and just holding the card together a bit more. You've also got Nvidia's new 12-pin power connector on the rear. There's been a point of debate for many people, but it's not caused any problems in our testing of maybe 4 4090s and 3 4080s so far. A nice backplate at the back with an exhaust hole to allow air to flow all the way through. And it also has a screen just up here, which is absolutely overkill, but does it look sick? Most definitely. I'll be diving into detailed benchmarks later, even more so than the ones we touched on just a moment ago. So make sure to stay tuned for that. But first, let's go ahead and actually get this build put together. Now, in our testing that we've done, the 4090 is going to bottleneck on anything less than an i7 from 13th gen, but the 4080 is going to be okay with this, the new plucky Core i5. The reason that's the case is because actually this is a chip that punches well above its weight. Don't let the i5 tagline scare you. You got loads of cores, loads of threads, great clock speeds, and it punches with the big boys if you look at some of the graphs in terms of not only keeping up with its i7 and i9 bigger brothers, but also beating out, rather embarrassingly for AMD, some of their more expensive expensive CPUs. I'll be pairing it up with this, the AORUS Z790 Elite AX. I was tempted to go for their AORUS master board, tie in that master theme, but I decided in the end that actually, if we're going to go for that i5 SKU, I wanted to build a more restrained, real-life 4080 PC build that you guys can actually replicate at home, rather than me going, here's a $1,200 GPU and here's a $600 motherboard just for the and giggles. This motherboard's still great though. You still get access to PCI Generation 5 for SSDs and future GPUs, but the 4080 and 4090 only use Gen 4, as well as next generation DDR5 memory. So this board is by no means a budget Z790 option, just a very good middle ground, which is what I wanted to opt for today. Oh, yes. Whoa, that was nearly bad. That just goes to show just how sort of volatile these sockets can be. Make sure you've got that arm all the way down. There's a lot of pressure if it's not quite seated correctly, as I think we've all just learned. RAM and storage-wise, I've gone for a couple of old faithfuls. Memory, I've got 32 gigs of Corsair's Vengeance RGB DDR5. You can pick up a DDR4 motherboard and RAM kit to save a bit of money if you like, but I think DDR5 makes sense for the next-gen sort of feel of the build. I'll be pairing it up with 2TB Seagate Firecuda 530. Want to save some cash, you could drop down to the 1TB model, but I like my games, I like my storage, so I think a bigger drive like this is good. We've reviewed this on the website and been really impressed. You're looking at 7 GB a second read and write, which is something no other drive, not even Samsung's new 990 Pro achieves. Awesome work, Seagate. At this stage of the build, I've got a couple of options. I could go and install the motherboard straight into the case, but first I'm going to prep some of my CPU cooler. Now, I've gone for a liquid cooler in this build, something I'd recommend you do with any of the latest Intel 13th gen processors. However, if you're not sure about what coolers to go for, shameless plug incoming, we've published loads of content on GeekaWhat.com about everything from the best motherboards to the best CPU coolers and the best memory for 13th gen. Go and give it a read, it's definitely worth your time, and we're sure you'll find a couple of things in there that take your fancy. Anyway, shameless plugs aside, the Cooler Master Liquid PL360 Flux. There's too many naming schemes for these things, I can't possibly remember them all, is the cooler I've gone for. The reason is pretty simple. It's a good value 360mm unit. On the whole, the bigger, the better when it comes to CPU coolers. In the box, there's a couple of things to look out for. So the first is this. Now this is my backplate, and this is what's going to actually clamp all of the cooler into place. If you pick up the motherboard and just spin it round, you'll be able to see you've got 4 holes around the processor. These, in theory, should all line up with the backplate. We can pop the backplate through, and it's even got some 3M tape to stick it down and stop it going anywhere. You also want to pick yourselves out of the box. These are like a male-to-male post with a screw stopper on the end. Take the female stopper off the top, so it's just a male-to-male screw head, and add this into the backplate screw threads now poking through the motherboard. I'm going to finish the rest of the cooler later, but trust me, this is going to make our life a lot easier. The case that I've opted to go for in this build is hopefully the Cooler Master TD500 mesh. I say hopefully, I might have made a bit of a mistake. If I'm being really honest with you, I knew how big the 4090 was. I thought the 4080 was going to be smaller, but alas, it's not smaller. Now let's see if it fits. Right, so it does fit just about, but my radiator is going to have to go at the top, which is kind of annoying. But I think the moral of the story is you should probably check what case you're going to go for and include any radiator dimensions and how much room that will take off your GPU clearance before buying something. Luckily, I have a backup lying around. That could have been a bad situation. Now then, starting to come together, starting to look pretty good, but there are a couple of things that I need to really think about before the next stage of the build. With the radiator going at the top of the case, I could install that now, but then I'm not going to be able to access any of my power cables or fan headers. So I think what I'm going to do is add the power supply in first. I've picked up Corsair's HX1000i, maybe marginally overkill, but it has the new PCI Gen 5 power connector out the box, which means a lot to me because it removes the need for that really horrible 3 or 4-way adapter and is fully modular with a really great efficiency. In the current climate of energy, having to be very efficient can't be a bad thing. Then, after that, I think I might now go ahead and install the radiator with some of those cables already accessed and out the way. The only other thing I need to do for the CPU cooler is just swap out the pre-installed brackets for AMD for these ones here, which are for Intel. Then I'll be adding the fans onto the radiator on this side to exhaust air through the rad and popping that at the very top of the case. The water block is next, and this should be pretty simple. Now, I do need to pop some thermal paste on, but I'm just going to do a test fit first. AORUS to see what kind of orientation and settings I want to go for. So that, actually, completely perfect. To make my life a bit easier though, I am going to flip the case over onto its back, and then that way gravity is not going to be fighting against me, before adding on a quick drop of the included thermal paste and dropping the water block into place. Lovely stuff. So you can see there, that fits A-OK. I'm going to add on those sort of thumb screws I talked about earlier that we removed. These really, really small ones, and that's going to clamp everything down exactly as we need it. Start them off with your fingers and then tighten them up with a screwdriver afterwards. And with all of that done, there's only really one main component left to add in, and that is of course the AORUS RTX 4080. We're going to pull the case in just a little bit closer, then we can slide it in, line it up and click it down. Here we go. Boom. Wow. Look at that. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that is interesting here, the side panel is only just gonna close. I've never had that before where this much room, in addition to the PCI lanes, has been needed to fasten it in. That's gonna be a very tight room for the GPU cable. Let's screw this thing in with one and then of course 2 screws to stop it sagging too much and add our GPU power to round things off. Oh yes, here we go. Pull it through, pull it a little bit tight. That thing looks incredible. I was gonna add an exhaust fan. Definitely not going to fit. This case is well and truly full. But does this thing actually turn on? How does it all perform? I guess there's only one way to find out. It's time to grab a keyboard, a mouse, a singular mouse, and a 4K monitor and see exactly what this thing is made of. So, a few days have passed. I've spent some time wiring up this system, and while I did that, I also swapped out for some slightly fancier Cooler Master fans at the front of the case. But is this thing going to turn on? Well, I guess there's only one way to find out. Short it with a screwdriver. All the fans light up. You can see why I put these ones in. They look awesome. But will it post to our AORUS gaming monitor? AORUS GPU, AORUS monitor. It looks like we are indeed working. We are into Windows. There's some drivers to install and some games, of course, to get loaded up in order to see just how well this thing performs. Starting off with COD Warzone. So let's do this. Let's start things off with a slightly older but still popular title and work through to the more intense games as we go. Call of Duty Warzone, we used 4K high settings with DLSS set to performance and pulled in 173 frames per second on the AORUS RTX 4080. This was around 5 FPS more than the Founders Edition card and in the region of 30 frames lower than the RTX 4090. A pretty good start then so far. I also tested out Apex Legends and here received some pretty good mileage with the AORUS RTX 4080 pulling in 155 frames per second, on par with AMD's 6950 XT, a card which typically punches above its weight in Apex, and around 30 FPS lower once again, or 20% lower than the RTX 4090, which of course costs a chunk more money. I also tested out Cyberpunk 2077 and used a few different settings combinations here to get a good idea of the performance. In Cyberpunk 2077 you can access DLSS 2 and DLSS 3, and we went ahead and tested all of those combinations. At 4K high settings, with RTX set to Ultra and DLSS 2.0 enabled, we pulled in 68 FPS. I mean, it's okay, but it's not exactly great. And that is where DLSS 3.0 comes in. Turn up to 4K high with RTX on Ultra settings and DLSS 3 enabled, adding in Nvidia's fancy frame generation tech, and the FPS skyrocketed to 120 frames per second. This was a very sizable increase in FPS, and put this card around 4 frames faster than the Founders Edition 4080. In F1 2022 at 4K high settings with DLSS 3 enabled, this card pulled in an impressive result as well. We're talking 178 frames per second on average. This was 8 FPS more than the Founders Edition 4080 and around 45 to 50 frames less than the more pricey 4090. The gaming experience looked fantastic. Very playable, enjoyable frame rates and a smooth gaming experience. Fortnite, when testing at 1080p competitive settings, the frames were also very good. The AORUS RTX 4080 was only 28 frames lower than our best result ever, with 307 on average. Competitive settings is where you tune everything down to low and set the render distance to far. It puts a lot more strain on the CPU, meaning we're probably seeing a bit of a CPU bottleneck here on any of those results for 300 frames or above. Nevertheless though, the 4080 performed well and provided a fantastic experience in Fortnite. Marvel's Spiderman Remastered was also good, 4K high, and we pulled in here 118 frames per second. second. Once again, utilising that new DLSS tech really helps to push our frame rates further here with ray tracing enabled. Valorant was also tested on this machine, 4K high, and the 4080 pulled in 450 frames per second. This was very impressive, and once we're over that even 200, let alone over 400 frames per second, to be honest with you, the extra frame rate isn't really all that useful. I also popped Overwatch 2 on our test rig at 4K Ultra. We're talking true 4K, no render scaling or anything like that. 215 FPS at 4K was the result, more frame rate than you can find refresh rate on any high-end monitor right now. The 4080 is certainly a solid performer, and while I was a little disappointed with just how large this card is, and that AMD's new units might just undercut it on price, for now it's a fantastic buy for those who want maybe not quite the best of the best RTX 4090 performance, but something that comes pretty damn close for a lower price point. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.